Hello, and welcome once again to a Beatles show that we call Things We Said Today. This is a weekly talk show podcast in which we talk about anything and everything that has to do with the Beatles, their past, the present, possibly the future. I'm Ken Michaels, one of the four regular co-hosts of the show, known for my syndicated Beatles show called Every Little Thing, being joined by my other regulars. First of all, the writer for Beatles Examiner, the number one news source for Beatle fans on the internet. That's Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And we also have longtime writer for Beatle Fan Magazine, Al Sussman. Hi, Al.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
Also a writer for Beatle Fan and for many music publications, and an author of several Beatle books, that being Allan Kozinn. Hi, Allan.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
On today's show, we have a very special guest with us, and that's Philip Norman. We all know Philip from having written the Beatles biography Shout, and he's also written a biography on John Lennon called John Lennon: The Life. Also biographies on the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger, Elton John, Buddy Holly. And Philip has just released a new biography on Paul McCartney, also called The Life. And we welcome Philip Norman to Things We Said Today. Hi, Philip.
Hi, thank you very much.
Before we talk about the book on Paul, we have to note the passing of Tony Barrow, who was the Beatles press officer from 1962 to 1968. And as long as we have Philip on the show, Philip knew Tony. So you want to say some words about Tony and your relationship with him?
Yes. Well, when the Beatles first started to sort of be noticed in Britain, and we started to hear the name Brian Epstein and NEMS Enterprises, I was still on my very first newspaper, a tiny weekly newspaper in East Anglia. And I suddenly started getting in the post releases about the Beatles from Tony Barrow. This is a measure of how thorough he was and how he valued all of the press and all of the media at that time. And I was thrilled to bits, absolutely thrilled to get these. I remember there was one that had cut out heads in a circle, as if they were pupils in a school. They were the Beatles, and they were Jerry and the Pacemakers. And in the middle, there was Brian Epstein wearing a scholastic mortarboard, as if he was the headmaster. And it just, that so impressed me that even I, lowly as I was getting noticed by Tony Barrow. Then when I talked my way into their dressing room on their very last UK tour of Britain, we didn't know it was their last, but it was their last. I actually met him for the first time, officiating, a most nice, calm, unofficious man who didn't stop me being in the room with the Beatles because I was just, again, from a local newspaper. I do remember his pointed black suede shoes as well. I still can picture them. And then over the years, incredibly helpful and nice when I was doing my Beatles book, and then later on doing the John Lennon book. And he was just, in his own way, as unique a publicity officer as Derek Taylor, the famous Derek Taylor in the later era for the Beatles.
What would you say made him so unique, apart from the fact that he recognized everybody in trying to get the Beatles publicity?
Well, he had been a journalist himself, or he was a writer. I mean, he was and so had Derek Taylor, actually. So their hearts were on the side of the hacks, really, even though they were working for the Beatles. And he would help you, as far as he could, as long as you played fair with him. But he was a very, sensible northern chap. He wasn't taken in by, all of the sort of flim-flam of show business the way other PRs might have been. And you always would have a reasonable response from Tony Barrow, and a sensible response.
Do you know how Tony handled, because you read about when the Beatles had certain problems, like the Beatles being bigger than Jesus controversy, and how that whole thing boiled over in the United States. He had to work on that with Brian and with the Beatles, as well as the incident in the Philippines. Did he handle it all very calmly, or was
He did, and I mean, he's thought in that particular instance of the comment, which upset so many people in America, which it had been made in Britain some months before. It caused no comment at all. It was when it was picked up by an American magazine it had such a devastating effect. And he knew, really, that something had to come from John. An apology had to come from John, and so an apology did come from John. And John, in fact, respected Tony Barrow. And in that instance, he just followed the advice of Tony.
Okay.
Did you interview him for the McCartney book, or was that at this point not necessary?
No, I didn't. Yes, I did. Yes, no. Yeah, we had a conversation about it. Yes, because it was all about Paul when he met them in a pub, first of all, and Paul was being tremendously socially adept and taking everybody's orders for drinks in the pub.
Okay.
It didn't include paying the bar bill.
Right. Okay.
Before we talk about your book, guys, you want to say anything about Tony Barrow?
No, I think so. I don't know if Philip has said anything I would have said, I think so.
Mm-hmm. I think the one thing, though, is the Fab Four designation that has, become such a predominant label for them, and he's the one that's been credited with that. I think that's, that's pretty interesting that he was the one that did that.
If he said he invented it, I think we can believe him.
Yeah. I think that's pretty, it's pretty interesting. That moniker has been used continually from I remember it back in '64, and we're still using it now. So amazing.
In Holland, my book is being is out in Holland as well at the moment, and it was translated by 4 different people who called themselves the Fab Four.
Maybe Tony should have gotten a royalty for that.
Well, that's the trouble. We can't copyright phrases. That's a pity.
Exactly. Yeah. He was also the one who came up with those fact sheets that we saw. Those of us who were, at least here in America, were kind of in on the ground floor. We saw a lot of those fact sheets in the teen magazines here. That Ringo didn't like Donald Duck or onions, that kind of thing, and and John and Paul both like blondes and Bridget Bardot, that sort of thing. So all of that came from Tony Barrow.
Well, he was, he had one foot in the music press, and all the weekly trades in this country used to be very superficial, and yes, those they were called lifelines.
Right.
Paul likes Buddy Guy. We thought, who the hell's Buddy Guy? Seemed very, very clever at the time.
It kind of predates the whole list thing today, where a lot of websites do lists. That's kind of the same idea if you think about it. So.
Yes.
Good idea.
I think there's just one thing that, it's in a section of Philip's book where he's talking about Paul and John sniping at each other in Melody Maker. And this phrase didn't get into the book, but I was looking at the articles this morning when Paul did an interview in Melody Maker and is critical of John because of, how do you sleep? And John wrote back, and in responding to Paul's comments about the hype around Let It Be, John says, well, you have to admit it really was a new phase Beatles album, wasn't it? And the phrasing was almost like the style of the great Barrow himself. So John is looking back at Tony Barrow as someone who would come up with these kind of phrases.
And it shows how papers like the Melody Maker was still so important to John. He used to, the best letter of the week used to get an album as a prize, and John would write at the bottom of his own letters, album winner.
Well, also where Tony Barrow is concerned, he also wrote the liner notes on the back of Beatle albums, the first few.
Right.
Yeah.
And
right.
I think one thing we should be eternally grateful to Tony Barrow for is that it was his idea that the Beatles do their own Christmas messages. And, how much we cherish those every single year when we listen to them.
As it gets more and more amazing how sarcastic John is being. Nobody noticed at the time.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about the new book. Again, it's called Paul McCartney, The Life. And so I just want to start by asking you the question, why is it all these years, it took you this long to write a book on Paul, and there may be some people who might think that this is a response to some of the negative criticism you might have gotten when Shout came out, that it was a bit biased towards John. You know, I mean, yes. I know Paul in fact referred to the book to a certain word that sounds like Shout. So was this kind of your own way of maybe making up to Paul?
Well, there is an element of that in it, because I was not fair to Paul in Shout, and I admit that. And by the time I came to write the biography of John Lennon, I had realized that I hadn't been fair to him. And in fact, he had phoned me after Shout came out, unexpectedly, Paul had, after I had talked to Yoko in the Dakota building only 5 months after John's death, actually. And she had made some comment about John having said Paul hurt him more than anybody else had ever hurt him. And Paul saw this in the Sunday Times and phoned up, and I was out, so my girlfriend took the call. But I didn't try to get back to him, because I thought, that's the finish. I'm not going to write another Beatles biography. That's it. I've done it. But of course, I hadn't done it. You never get away once you've done it. Done one. It's like Michael Corleone, you know. But then when I set about the John Lennon book, which I thought, because I had Yoko's cooperation, that would not allow me to have anything to do with Paul's cooperation, because I thought, if I have one, I just don't have the other. The Beatles' politics are like that. But again, he phoned me. I sent a message via his PR, and he actually phoned me. And I talked to him for about half an hour. And he said, I'm phoning just to see what this bloke's like, you know, that hates me so much. I said, I don't hate you at all. It's not true. And we had a very nice conversation, because I was not a writer trying to get quotes out of him. I was just talking to him like another bloke. And he helped me on the John Lennon book by email. He answered some crucial questions of fact by email very generously. But again, I didn't think of doing a book on him. But then I realized that there should be a companion volume to the Lennon one. And I contacted him, and within literally a couple of weeks, I got a 4-line email from McCartney saying, I'm happy to give you tacit approval. So that tacit approval meant that I could talk to people very close to him, like his brother-in-law, John Eastman, who had never talked about Eastman's involvement in the final days of the Beatles, and people like Peter Asher. He has a stepmother, of course, and a stepsister, and I could talk to them. So in the end, he sort of accepted that there is a sort of element of contrition, if not apology, in this book.
I certainly sense that. We do this like a round table, so each of the guys will ask you a question. Why don't we start with Al?
Well, matter of fact, I did want to ask about a couple of the people who are obviously major players in this book, and one of whom is Jim McCartney, who I think a lot of us knew somewhat about, but is I think took to liking him a great deal as a character, because obviously you didn't know him, but as a character in the book, say, so to speak. What was your impression of Jim McCartney?
Well, any understanding of Paul McCartney has to come from understanding Jim McCartney, his father, who never earned more than about £10 a week in the Liverpool cotton industry, when Liverpool still had a cotton industry. And yet, especially after the death of Paul and his brother Michael's mother, when Paul was 14, managed to create this happy and stable home for the two boys, helped by a large extended family. And he instilled into both of them, and particularly into Paul, the very best of values, which are still there. I mean, despite all of the wealth and all of the adulation that Paul has received. He is fundamentally a decent human being. He may have his moments of egomania, whatever it may be, petulance, whatever, but he is still his father's son. And luckily, I was able to talk to Jim McCartney's second wife, Angie. He didn't get married. He didn't seem to look at another woman after the loss of Paul's mother, Mary, until Jim was into his 60s. He suddenly met a much younger, very vivacious woman, Angie, and he adopted her daughter, Ruth. So Paul acquired a stepmother and a stepsister, and he was exactly the same, obviously exactly the same with his little stepdaughter Ruth, and with Angie, as he had been with Paul and Michael. These little sayings, his funny little sort of Liverpool proverbs and things he would say, the way he attached great importance to regular bowels, the way he got lavender from the garden and made the house smell of lavender. And he just obviously was a lovely man. And of course, as you know, he was the only real music teacher that Paul ever had. Jim had had a little local amateur jazz band in the 1920s and 1930s in Liverpool. He loved Hollywood show tunes. He loved northern brass band music. And he passed all of that on to Paul. And so you see the influences in Sgt. Pepper and, you know, all the very much the mainstream part of Paul's music is thanks to his father. So his father was hugely important.
Allan?
Okay. Shall I ask a sort of critical question?
Whatever you like.
Okay. You know, there's been an awful lot of research on the Beatles since Shout, and a number of things, a number of the standard stories have changed. And for instance, the one about Ringo turning up and George Martin not knowing he was coming. I mean, the chronology isn't quite that way. I mean, Ringo turned up the session before he hired Andy White. And also the whole business of how EMI signed the Beatles in the first place. It was basically forced on George Martin. And I'm just sort of wondering whether, you know, presumably you've run into this research, seeing as, you know, this is what you do. I'm wondering if you didn't take those things into account because your sources lead you to believe that the standard stories are somehow more accurate.
Well, I didn't set out to plod through the whole story of the Beatles all over again in this book. Obviously, it is a hugely important part and perhaps to many people still the most interesting part. But I felt that the years since the Beatles for McCartney, which had been virtually ignored, actually, by any sort of so-called serious biographers, really needed attention. And so, you know, and that period is longer than John Lennon's lifetime since the Beatles broke up. So what I did, as you all have read in the book, is to keep Paul center stage all the time. There are many things like the as you say, the chronology of Ringo at the first recording sessions, or Shea Stadium, or something like that. People will know what I'm talking about when I say Shea Stadium or the MBE. So I didn't plod through the whole story all over again. I felt it was more important to have McCartney center stage and reacting to the events as they happened.
Okay. Did you actually come to like him more as you researched the book than, say, obviously maybe you like him more than during the time you wrote Shout, but as you finished the book, did you come to sort of have some sort of sympathy for him?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because what I discovered was this person who has been blessed with all these amazing gifts by heaven, not only huge talent, but enormous charm, amazing good looks. You would think someone like that would be the most complacent human being there ever was. He's not, and he never was. In his own sort of way, he was as insecure as John Lennon was. John, as we know, his insecurity came from what he thought was a fractured and unwanted, sort of being an unwanted child, although he wasn't really. Lots of his family actually were competing to take care of him. With Paul had a happy and stable family life. He has this amazing talent, which, like all amazing talent, does not allow the possessor of the talent ever to feel secure. There is never any self-satisfaction really with him. And so that's why to this day he is still on most nights of the year doing 3 hours on stage without an intermission or a sip of water, because right. he can never feel sort of that he's done what he wanted to do, despite all of what he's achieved and all the rewards that he's.
Mm-hmm. You had said just a second ago that some people find the Beatles segment of his career more interesting still. I was just wondering, what about you? I mean, if you look at the totality of his music, which you would have sort of been through during the writing of this book, Do you feel that his solo career does measure up to those 10 years with the Beatles, 10, 12 years?
It can't measure up because the world was different. He was different. He was older. Their achievement, Lennon and McCartney, it's amazing to realize, is when they're in their very, very early 20s. It's just amazing what they achieved. Later on, the world was harder and more cynical. But McCartney didn't stop being a wonderful songwriter at the end of the Beatles. He just didn't, that sort of talent just didn't switch off. But it becomes harder to find the really exceptional songs because he was, wanting a commercial, successful band in the 70s that first rode on the glam rock thing and later on sort of stadium rock as it evolved. But you can find McCartney songs like that song Dear Friend, which is as sweet and, lovely and inspired as anything he ever wrote, which was hardly even noticed when it came out on the Ram album. Mm-hmm. John obviously never knew it existed. Otherwise, John wouldn't have been slinging mud at Paul in How Do You Sleep? So there was, and the song Waterfalls later on, which has a kind of awful prophecy of losing Linda to me, because his voice has so much more pathos than it ever had before or ever would again. So there are those examples, but of course, what he wanted to do was to have a numerically, statistically successful band to rank with the Beatles in the 70s, and that's what he achieved.
Mm-hmm. So then, apart from the Beatles, looking at his solo career, what would you rate as his best work?
Well, those songs, I think, more infrequent. I think he's just the same as John. Each of them was always looking over his shoulder at the other and what the other was doing, even though they professed to be become independent from each other. But I think that as a sort of commercial album, which was the one that finally got him the, critical and popular acclaim, Band on the Run, it's a very good, it's a great commercial album. But I think they're more sort of scattered among a huge output, from this band whose personnel was continually changing.
Okay, Steve.
Thank you for doing this, Philip. It's great to be able to talk to you. Let me ask you. Well, there's two things I'm going to start. I'm going to start with the real loves of Paul's life, and I'm going to start with Jane Asher. I mean, it seems like every time the discussion about Jane Asher comes up, everybody there's always kind of a wishing that he had stuck with Jane Asher, although everybody loves Linda now, and of course and Nancy gets a lot of is much loved also. But what happened? What do you think happened with Paul and Jane Asher? Why didn't that work?
I think, well, they were still young, both of them. She had a very good career, which was actually improving all the time. And I think that was a bit of difficulty. I think there was enough of the old sort of North Country chauvinist in him to sort of rather, wish she would concentrate all her attention on him. He also had an amazing sort of choice of virtually all the young women in the world were at his disposal if he wanted. And he made full use of that prerogative, there's no doubt. Whereas if you think about all the years he was married to Linda, there is not one breath of alleged infidelity in that whole time. That is really amazing in that sort of world. Admittedly, she was on most of the tours. That wouldn't necessarily have stopped it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about Nancy? Was that? Nancy kind of, as I recall, came up from kind of nowhere, and the romance really blossomed. And it appears from all indications that they're getting along great. What do you think happened with Nancy? Did he just find somebody in after Linda's death? Did he just find somebody that he needed to have, or? Well,
as we know, he made quite a hasty marriage, which didn't last all that long and cost him quite dear. And what he told a very famous producer in the West End here that he wanted really as he got older was someone to be waiting in the wings every night when he came off stage to say, "You were wonderful, darling." Now, there's an indication of someone who is not smug at all, really. And in fact, Tony Brownwell whose name I'm sure you all know, said that Linda was Jewish, actually, technically, and she was from New York, and Nancy is a Jewish woman from New York who has also got lots of money of her own. And all these all tick sort of very, firmly tick boxes, obviously, with Paul. And she just seems a thoroughly nice woman. His children all seem to love her, particularly his son, who's had problems. James has had problems, particularly with Heather. And she has just obviously completely embraced this quite unhappy and insecure young man in a rather wonderful way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Getting back to what you said about his insecurity and touring and continuing to tour, that kind of interweaves in there, doesn't it, with the romance thing? That he needs somebody, that he found somebody so quickly, like Nancy, and he's done so well. You're right. I mean, he has a history, especially if you go way back, of having a lot of women. As you say, he could have had anybody, and it's interesting that he, that he's locked into locked into two marriages that really were good for him, that he really, that really worked for him. So,
well, when Linda first appeared on the scene, she was getting just almost as much sort of horrible comment in the press and from the fans as Yoko, who they were more or less around the same time. And no one could imagine that Paul, who had his pick of all these gorgeous young 60s, they used to call them dolly birds, and yet he went for someone who looked like she brushed her hair very often, But Linda actually answered a need in him that nobody imagined could be there, which was that he wanted a home and a family. And that was, she had her own insecurities as well, and she lost her own mother when she was very young, and that was what worked. She made this wonderful home environment, particularly out of the farm in Scotland that he bought while he was with Jane, but he'd never really sort of done much to it. And suddenly, they were making that their permanent base for a lot of the time.
Okay, let me get a little ahead. Are you thinking about doing biographies of George Harrison or Ringo?
No.
No.
They're not going to pull me back in again. They're not going to pull me back in again. I was thinking the other night that perhaps if it were a book about the two of them as the second division, the other ranks. But I know that, George has a huge following and is esteemed very greatly. I've never felt that he was remotely on the level of Lennon and McCartney. I think that what happened was that some of their magic rubbed off on him eventually, but it didn't really last once he was any distance away from them. And I think it would be quite toilsome to write about his religious parallel career and all of that. Though I know it was absolutely sincere and probably, saved his sanity in lots of ways, because they all, had something we could never imagine about the Beatles, that they could be under horrible pressure and be suffering. But of course they were for a lot of the time because of the completely unreal life they had to lead.
Right. Getting back to McCartney, one last question. What do you think of there's been a lot of comment online about the upcoming release of Pure McCartney, and some people have been really critical. I think we've just talked about it ourselves. What do you think that indicates? How do you see that release as, in the scope of his career and why he's putting it out at this particular time?
I mean, I can only say that he is never going to stop, while he has breath. He's never going to stop putting out albums. And we've seen in the last 10, 15 years that they can contain some very, very good things. They're not just someone trading on his, the huge sort of nostalgia or the huge affection that the human race cherishes towards him. He's still finding new things to say and new things to play.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Philip. Go ahead, Ken.
I want to bounce off something that you just said before, Philip, and also, Steve, you were talking about it too. This constant touring from Paul and this need to keep working, keep doing what he normally does, to satisfy his fans and I'm sure to satisfy his own, artistic process and everything that he does. Do you think that after all these years and after everything that he's accomplished, and he still is the most successful songwriter of all time, do you think that he's unfulfilled in his mind?
I just think that this kind of adulation, I've seen it with others too. You see it with Mick Jagger and you see it with Elton John. It doesn't, as I say in my book, it's a bit like Chinese food. An hour after you receive it, you want some more. And straight through them. And I think that that's what it is. He needs to have this reaffirmed, really, the love of the audience, the fact that he can cast such magic over the audience. He needs to keep on proving it. Now, this man is getting into his 70s. It's amazing that he is. This is someone playing music that you once weren't supposed to be able to play after the age of 30.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And yet he's up. But he's also he's not only as a huge part of his stage performance made up of Beatles songs, very often songs that were identified with John once upon a time. But he also goes really sort of deeply into his own sort of back catalogue of tracks like Temporary Secretary, which was weird when it came out and still is weird, actually. But he still plays them. And he says it's so funny that, from the audience, whenever he's playing a Beatles song, there's millions of little phone lights as he's being photographed. But as soon as he does Temporary Secretary, the arena goes black.
Interesting.
Well, I find it a very interesting song myself. But I would like to bring up one thing here specifically about something that you wrote about the Lennon-McCartney songwriting credit. And I'm going to quote you here. This is in page 182. It says, by Paul's account, the decision was taken by Brian and John. This is for it to be in that order, Lennon-McCartney. And when Paul protested, not very strongly, they told him it wasn't set in stone, but could be alternated in the future. It was always my impression that John and Paul decided this together, that it would be Lennon-McCartney, probably because it flowed better, I think. But it was only later on when it started to bother him, when there were songs like Yesterday, which John had nothing to do with. Why couldn't they be McCartney-Lennon? So I think it's only like, you notice with Wings Over America when that came out, that those Beatles songs that were Paul songs came out as McCartney-Lennon. And, was it really decided by John and Brian as, I guess you're saying that's what Paul said.
That's what Paul says. And as you know, some of the very early examples of the credit, it was McCartney-Lennon, and then suddenly it became Lennon-McCartney, which follows the sort of alphabetical sort of convention anyway of songwriters, songwriting credits. And but I think this should give us all some comfort that, how even if you're as famous and as wealthy and as adulated as Paul McCartney, things can still niggle at you inside, little things. And that did with him for a long, long time. And he says it doesn't, or he lives with it now because he doesn't want to seem to be sniping at John. But I still don't think he likes the idea, particularly as, he looked on his iPad or he looked on his phone at the credit once and for Yesterday, and it said John Lennon and blank as the songwriting credit.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So he's obviously seeing it all the time, and every time he sees the credit, of course, it reminds him.
And actually, on the Please Please Me album, the Lennon-McCartney songs were listed first as McCartney-Lennon, but that was supposed to be a mistake that George Martin made. At least that's what I think Mark Lewison had said.
Well, all I can say is that Paul himself says that it was decided by Brian and John to make it Lennon-McCartney. How it got McCartney and Lennon in the first place, I can't imagine.
Okay. What would you say, if you could pick one or two of them, were the biggest revelations in your book on Paul?
I think it's the character of Paul McCartney is the biggest revelation, because the world has such a fixed idea of him, and it's completely wrong. And there is this insecurity, and there is also the charm and the niceness, which is so unusual, always was so unusual, and still is in the field of or pop stardom, is to a large degree genuine. He really was like that, and where it came from was his father and his family. But actually, all through the book, there is an awful lot of new material. The problem I find is that I'm not talking about, obviously, present company in any way, but a lot of people who write reviews of new books on the Beatles or Beatle-related subjects, who call themselves experts, absolutely hate being told anything about the subject that they didn't know already. They absolutely hate it. And they try to, it's rather like in the Arabian Nights when the bride accidentally farts in the bridal chamber and all the serving women sort of rattle their jewelry to try and cover up the embarrassment. And so all these so-called experts sort of frantically rattle their jewelry to hide the fact they just read something they didn't know already. There's a lot of examples in this book about Jim McCartney, about the girlfriend that Paul had, Iris Caldwell, who was Rory Storm's sister, Rory Storm of the Hurricanes fame sister, who was a trapeze artist, then became a can-can dancer, and how her mother Paul used to like to relax by having Iris's mother comb the hair on his legs. No, you won't find that in any other book. Everything that John Eastman, virtually every word that John Eastman said about the era with Allan Klein and then the litigation after that is not in any other book before. The fact that Paul and John Eastman and Linda felt they really were on their own against the combined weight of Allan Klein, all his lawyers, the Apple lawyers, John, Paul and Ringo, all ganging up against Paul. And Paul was even running out of money. He was having to live on Linda's money. None of that has ever been in the book before. And that goes right through, really. Is his extraordinary, this secret girlfriend he had in the 60s, who was Marianne Faithfull's nanny, originally children's nanny. Maggie McGivern had never spoken to anyone at all about sort of parallel affair that went on while he was with Jane Asher, and how they used to meet at the only safe place he thought they could meet where no one would notice was at antique auction sales in Chelsea. They both had to go along and pretend to be bidding for bits of furniture, so they could meet. When I was writing those and the other passages I've talked about, I really sort of thought, my God, I really have never heard this before. And that was really some excitement to compensate for the terrible hard work of writing a book like this, which it obviously is.
All right, before I pass you over to Al, I just have one really important question here, and that is, because you were just touching upon this here, is the image that Paul projects of himself publicly really, is it genuine? Is that the real guy that we see? Because there are some people who think of Paul with that thumbs up, positive, it's like that Dana Carvey impersonation, which I think is very exaggerated. But he's always very positive. He hardly ever has anything bad to say about anybody, and that's probably the PR side of him. But is he really the image that he projects? I mean, I do believe in all my heart that everything that he does with his career is something that he loves doing. He loves recording. He loves performing, and he is very much the family man, especially that he has portrayed himself to be. He's always been so supportive of all the members of his family, every activity that they're involved with. He shows up occasionally, and this is all part of who Paul McCartney is. But is that really is that all there is to Paul, or is there another side that we really don't know?
I think we all have a dark side. Of course we do. But the very key word that you mention is positive. If you think of the best McCartney tracks, Good Day Sunshine, they just give you such a lift. They are so buoyant. I mean, he and John could sing a song that goes, I'm a loser, and make it sound happy. I'm down. That's a happy song. That is amazing. When they went on the dreadful tour of Scotland, backing Johnny Gentle, Paul was the one who was out there shaking hands, sending postcards to his father saying, I've been signing autographs, playing the role of Paul Ramone, as indeed he did. But the great example of that is when this incident, as a result of which he was in jail in Tokyo in 1980. Now, all the accounts of that you will read say that he was just held in a police station, and it somehow wasn't quite as bad as it needed to have been. For some reason, he was transferred from the police's custody to the Ministry of Justice after about 3 days, and he was incarcerated in a really terrible old prison with convicted killers, the mafiosi, and not treated any differently from the other prisoners. And he managed to almost enjoy it.
Wow.
Almost like a kind of rather severe health spa. Because for those few days, he didn't have to be Paul McCartney. He was prisoner number 22. He was one of the lads. They all got 2 cigarettes a day they could smoke. They had to smoke it around a tin that they then flick their ash into the tin. And he just made the most of it. And that is amazing to me. That sort of positive outlook, which is, if you think about it, the best part of McCartney music. Very, very seldom is there a sort of downer in a song by him. That is really the core of the man. It's being positive and exuberant. Now, the thumbs up and all the rest of it did get a bit too much, but still, that is very, very like the real McCartney. And for that sort of person to not only to exist in pop music, but to survive, to go on being that way, is a little miracle.
The drink it all in thing he does every night, where he tells the crowd, I want to drink it in. That kind of goes to that too. But yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Al?
Bouncing off something that you had said a few minutes ago about the kind of people who would be reading a book like this, what is basically your target audience for this book, or is there a target audience for this book?
Yes, absolutely. My target audience is someone who may not be, if such people do exist, and perhaps they still do, is people who aren't necessarily interested in the Beatles or interested in McCartney, but someone who will read this book, as a piece of writing, as an extraordinary epic story, which takes in the history of the last half century, or half of the previous century and a bit of this century. Because I try to write a book that is just a book that is a real biography, a real piece of literature, if I can aspire to that, which explains why this happened and the times in which it was happening. So I try to give the social background to what was happening in the world at the same time as what was happening to these very young men and the extraordinary events that they somehow or other precipitated.
I ask this because of the fact that in the book, especially in the section where you go really beyond the Beatles and into his post-Beatles career, the music is almost secondary to the story of Paul himself, as you mentioned earlier, that you've sort of put him in there as the central focus, which obviously it's a biography, but the music does seem to be kind of sublimated, whereas, for instance, toward the end of the book, there are pages and pages and pages and pages about the divorce proceedings between him and Heather. And I'm not sure whether that particular saga really rates the amount of amount of mileage, if you will, that there is in this book. So it's...
No, that is a valid comment, of course, if you think that. I think to go through every single McCartney album, you would need a very big book, and you might exhaust the patience of, even very devout admirers of his music. I felt that this episode with Heather Mills McCartney, deserved great detail, firstly because it was the point where the world, which had kind of regarded Paul McCartney as perhaps one of the most envied beings on earth, suddenly it felt good not to be Paul McCartney. He was going through this awful, first of all the marriage, then the separation, then the divorce. The worst year of all being when he was 64. Now, if you remember the idyllic picture he painted as a young boy of what he'd be like when he was 64, and what the reality, the irony was Greek in its scale and awfulness. So yes, and also the fact, that what it revealed about the life that he led, and his amazing, and not only the horrors, but the way that he absolutely involved himself in Heather's sort of interests in the same way he had with Linda, vegetarianism with Linda and animals and animal rights. With Heather, it was, the landmines campaign, all of that. He had this, great Scott Fitzgerald phrase, willingness of the heart, to get involved with what Heather was interested in. And also the amazing financial generosity, the amounts of money that were paid over in those years. So I couldn't ignore that. I couldn't just skate over that.
I see. Although, again, an awful lot of space is devoted to her brief. And, let's face it, in the opinion of a goodly number of people, if she said today is Monday, they wouldn't believe it. So one wonders how worthwhile it was to put out that amount of material, that, a good amount of which is probably fiction.
But there's an awful lot of, hard documentary evidence from that era of, her on the Larry King show, her on television. It's not just, I agree, her account itself might be fallible. But in fact, I for that reason, I didn't seek to interview her, although she has since contacted me. She has since texted me and told me some other things, which I'm still digesting.
I can only imagine.
Oh, I'd love to. Oh, can you reveal some of that, Philip?
I can't really. I can't, no. But her thesis, which she still sticks to, is that she was equally important. She was equally a celebrity with McCartney, and that she really did sort of. She was the one who got him back performing after the tragedy of Linda's death. But there again, other people will say, well, as people have sort of said over the few years, why bother about Wings? They were, in the end, they probably weren't as a unit, one of the great sort of original rock bands of all time, because that's not what they were meant to be. They were really a frame for Paul McCartney. But still, I thought that the Wings story was so interesting. The terribly unstable lineup for a start, and the number of people who came and went in that band was quite extraordinary, and the sort of the internal dynamic of the band was very, very. So I devoted a lot of space to Wings, as you can see. Some people might not care for.
Yes.
Can I ask something about the? We've all known that Paul has had a history with avant-garde music, and where does that stand as far as you're concerned in his life?
Yes, he always had a passionate interest. When he was, he won a competition for writing an essay about the Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953 when he was 11 years old, and with his he got a book token or something, and he bought a book on modern art. That's how interested he was, how early his interest in contemporary art was. But of course, another of his grievances, which doesn't seem to go away, was that John was always cast as the avant-garde, experimental Beatle, and Paul as the tuneful, the safe, the melodious Beatle. The fact was that he was living in central London. He was living in the attic of Jane Asher's parents' house in Wimpole Street, which is mostly an enclave of sort of high-priced private clinics and doctors and dentists, living on the top floor in a kind of very chaste, sort of almost a Peter Pan sort of world, with Jane one floor below, and no creeping about after lights out at all. And but Jane's brother was, Peter Asher, helped to start the Indica Gallery, which was the most avant-garde art gallery in London, and bookshop with Barry Miles as well. Paul was very involved in that. He was also someone who really wanted to learn about art and to get into all of these different sort of fields of, music, concrete, Luciano Berio, people like that, Takis, the sculptor. And then, of course, Rene Magritte as well. He fell in love with Rene Magritte through Robert Fraser, the art dealer. He was absolutely up to his neck on the avant-garde when, as he himself put it, John was living on a bloody golf course in Weybridge, which is deep in the stockbroker belt. And he was the one who was tipping John off about these things and encouraging him to read and to come up to London and see these exhibitions. And so it does, still obviously rankle with him that he has been miscast in this way by posterity.
Thank you.
Allan?
Pleasure.
Yeah, I think it's sort of his avant-garde thing is kind of interesting because while I believe that he really was the one who had those interests early, and that in Tomorrow Never Knows, those were actually his tape loops. It wasn't just that he got John interested in tape loops. He brought those tape loops in. And yet when he began writing classical music, he wrote really very late 19th, early 20th century classical music that didn't take into account the classical avant-garde at all. It's just kind of odd. What do you make of that?
I just think he wanted to be in the world of classical music, and that was what he was aiming for. And of course the other thing is that he was happy for those elements to be on Beatles albums, on Beatles singles and tracks, but within reason. And of course then John did it all over the place, and Revolution Number 9 and all of that. So, for Paul, it was sort of he was only really doing it to put tasters on the Beatles music, but John wanted it to be, dominant.
Mm-hmm. There was one episode in the book that I was just sort of wondering what your take on was. I mean, you explain it a little, but right after Jim dies, or while Jim is in his last illness, and you describe him as Paul is saying to Angie, "You'll never want for anything," and then pretty much immediately after Jim died, he sort of cut her off. What do you make of that? I mean, it seems like going off to Spain on a vacation after someone dies, after caring for them all that time, as you point out, seems a little extreme as a reason.
There were a couple of other things. There was something about his birth certificate having been sold. In fact, she says it was a certified copy. It wasn't the real birth certificate because she was short of money. I mean, immediately after Jim's death. But it does seem strange, and I can't really explain it. I think that family politics had a lot to do with it, perhaps more than even Angie sort of says, because it's still a very painful subject for her, though she's a very feisty woman now who has a life in America and markets Mrs. McCartney's herbal teas and that sort of thing. And I believe she even has a doctorate from somewhere. But it's just, that there was a large family circle who perhaps weren't so happy about her having married Jim, possibly. I can't speculate.
Have you had any reaction directly or indirectly from Paul since the book's been out?
No, I haven't. I mean, I'm hoping I'll get one, obviously, and I think I ought to get one since, it was done with his tacit approval. It actually, there is even, MPL copyright material in the book, fully acknowledged, but I haven't done so far. And in fact, I offered him the chance to read the text. Perhaps I should. I offered Yoko the same. And look what happened there. But he sent me back actually a very nice email saying, "I find it hard to decide what I think of me without really sort of finding out what you think of me." But I'd sent him a letter saying the line I was taking, which was that I was dwelling a lot about his father's influence, and also about his marriage to Linda. And he just said, "Your letter was reassuring, so go ahead," really.
Mhm. Okay. So we're winding down on our hour, so I should pass you back to Ken.
Oh, I just had a couple of comments based on what you recently said about the avant-garde thing, that it bothers Paul that John is perceived more as the avant-garde guy in the Beatles. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that not only were certain Beatles songs, at least now they're considered perhaps the most adventurous of the Beatles, A Day in the Life, I Am the Walrus, those songs, and Tomorrow Never Knows, despite Paul's involvement with the song. The fact that, John also was with Yoko, an avant-garde artist, and it was John and Yoko's idea to do Revolution Number 9.
Sure.
And while Paul did Carnival of Light, that never came out. So it's all, perception based on the fact that this is what was released, and
Exactly.
Paul was very much into the avant-garde. He just didn't show it as much in the music that he released.
But if you think about it, I mean, just stepping back a little bit, a song like Eleanor Rigby, how revolutionary was that?
Right.
It was. Penny Lane. George Melly said you get a picture of Liverpool in the 1950s from that song. If you never saw Liverpool in the 1950s, you can see the sandstone churches and you can see the green trams, streetcars. That was revolutionary in its own way. It was just pushing the bounds of what was possible. And that goes right back to the beginning when Lennon and McCartney was still skewing their songs to what they thought pop songs were like. Little bits of vernacular were creeping in from Paul that had never been in there before, in a pop song before. Sometimes when we're dreaming deep in love, not a lot to say. Not a lot. And it's so British understatement. Not a lot means nothing. For that to sort of turn up at that early stage in a pop lyric by Paul I think is extraordinary.
Right. Oh, I totally agree with you. I think when songs like Yesterday and Eleanor Rigby first came out and Penny Lane, people were just amazed at the arrangement and using classical elements and all that. I don't know if today people look at it the same way. I think a lot of people look at the weirder stuff,
Yes,
like I Am the Walrus, and admire that maybe perhaps a bit more unfairly.
Yes, because it does still sound very, very adventurous. Yes, it does. And so does A Day in the Life. But the funny thing at the time was that nobody kind of said, my God, this is extraordinary they're doing this. People just accepted, this is the Beatles. They accepted that every album was a huge step forward and they were pushing this or that boundary that had never been pushed before. It was extraordinary that, the expectation at the time was absolutely boundless of what they were going to do. And so no one ever sort of said, oh my God, no one's ever written a story about a poor woman sweeping up wedding rice in a church. They just accepted it.
Okay. And the other thing I do want to respectfully disagree with you on, Philip, is what you said about Wings being more or less recordings for, it was like Paul's framework. I think that, what was the phrasing you used? Because I do think that I think Paul really tried to establish Wings as a group, because if you look at the middle period of Wings, you do have a lot of songs from Denny Lane. And even during the Wings Over America tour, Denny sang lead on 5 songs. So it wasn't just all Paul. And even if you go to like a Wings at the Speed of Sound album, every member gets a lead vocal. So that was something that was very consciously done. So
I think he might well, I think he liked the idea of a band, yes, being in a band very much. But it could never work because of who he was. And I think Denny Lane was in there for another reason. It wasn't to sort of give Denny a bit of the spotlight. It was he just wanted someone who was a bit more his equal without actually being his equal. It was like having an adjutant for the head of a colonel of a regiment wanted an efficient adjutant on a slightly lower level.
That's an interesting theory.
I never heard anybody else say that before. Interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact,
I shouldn't have said it.
Matter of fact, kind of bouncing off of that, you discuss the partnership briefly, the partnership with Elvis Costello, and you kind of let it kind of hang in the air that perhaps it just didn't work out. What do you think was at the roots of that? Why didn't that work?
Well, this is the sort of unknowable side of McCartney, which is the musician, really. He evidently really liked working with Elvis Costello at that particular period, because Elvis Costello had a pair of glasses that reminded him of John, when John used to wear glasses, and Elvis Costello was a bit sort of cheeky and all of that, and punky and all that. And yet he didn't release the album. And that is just the sort of amazing prerogative of being Paul McCartney.
Okay. Philip, one more question. I mean, we've been talking about how positive he is. What would you say, to be critical of Paul, what's the most critical thing, the critical aspect of Paul? What is he, I guess, what is he what is he the hardest to get along with? What aspect of him is hardest to get along with?
You mean sort of the least likable side?
Yeah.
I don't know, because I think, the fact that a sort of an almost whole human being is still there is pretty amazing after all this time. Obviously very autocratic, very controlling, always was. A lot of the trouble in the Beatles, particularly from George in the later years, of course, was because of that reason. The conviction that he can do everything, but unfortunately he can do almost everything. There's even this sort of side of him that knows how to build flights of concrete steps, and mend holes in roofs and things like that, and cook and all of, he's and also all the designing of the album, or the conceptualizing of the later Beatles albums and the Wings albums, was him. He has an amazing array of gifts and aptitudes and talents.
Okay.
I just thought of one last question. But one thing that I've noticed about Paul through the years is that with the few exceptions of Ringo or George Martin and Dave Gilmour, once Paul stops working with someone, that's it. He doesn't come back and work with anybody from his past again. And you could say that about members of Wings. You could say that about the band with Hamish Stewart and Robbie McIntosh and those people. What is it about him that once he stops working with a certain artist, in most cases, is it just a matter of he wants to move on?
I think it certainly is. He wants to move on and sort of move into another current sort of, style. That was true of the two recruits to Wings that went to Japan in 1980, and they never got to tour. And they were both very, very good musicians. Of course they were. And when later in the early 80s he's got going again, maybe not as Wings, but they still expected to get the call to come back to the Colours, and they didn't. And that's exactly an illustration of what you said, that he feels they've run their course, and they had hardly any course to run in that instance.
Well, you always heard it said the Beatles didn't like to repeat themselves. So maybe Paul's kind of carrying on that tradition in his own way.
I think it's probably what you said, that he feels it's a new phase where he has to be different and rise to a new challenge.
Okay, well, Philip, this has been wonderful chatting with you here. And,
I'm so glad we got it together in the end.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Philip. This has been really fantastic.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And
so
once
much.
again, the book is called Paul McCartney, The Life. Would you like us to just mention Amazon or any other place where you can purchase it?
Yes, it's a pick on Amazon, or you can get it at Costco, Barnes & Noble, anywhere. I'll be coming to New York with a barrow selling copies myself in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
Thank you very much, anyway.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here with us. And guys, you have anything you want to plug? Your own contact information? Steve?
They can catch me at BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. I'm and also in the Beatles news and commentary group, which is growing daily, it seems. And we also want to say you can contact the show at thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and I notice we're getting more followers every week, and so thank you for that. And we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, Al, how about you?
You can contact me on Facebook at Al Sussman, or on Twitter, at ASUSS49, or through Beatle Fan Magazine, www.beatlefan.com.
And Allan, how about you?
Oh, probably the best way to contact me is through Facebook at Allan Kozinn, or my alter ego, Allan Kozinn Remixed.
And as for me, Ken Michaels, you can check out my website, kenmichaelsradio.com, and you can also email me directly at everylittlething@att.net. All right, once again, Philip, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Phil.
On behalf of Steve Marinucci, Al Sussman, Allan Kozinn, and Philip Norman, I'm Ken Michaels, thanking all of you for listening, and we will see you next time.